from Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 to 12. It's found on page 1707. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words. On the seventh day, God rested from all his works. And again, in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. For the word God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. This is the word of the Lord. I've got I think all the kids are in the back room, and that's fine. But if they're watching, there is a worksheet for them to follow along with the sermon, and if they write anything on that, they can take something out of this bag at the end of the service, because I am nothing if not open to bribery or willing to bribe. So let me pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are God. We thank you that you're the God who speaks. We thank you that you're the God who listens. Father, as we finish this year, as we think about, continue our thoughts on how to hope, and we think about rest and how that fits into it. Father, I pray that this time in your word would be fruitful for us as we consider how to live as your people. Amen. How you going? Let me say that often the answer to this question in our city, in my experience, is that we answer quickly. We answer busy. The answer seems to often be, how you going? I'm busy. People seem to be busy almost constantly. There's a reality where I think it's almost a matter of pride in our city, where so much of our status is caught up in the concept of what you produce, who you are, where you live. And so busyness is a badge of honour. It's where our identity so often can be found. Whether it's because of our work or our housing issues, the houses we own, the houses we've sold, the houses we're repairing, our study, our kids, the parents we're responsible for, the churches. We have reasons to be busy. And I wonder sometimes whether it's okay to not be busy, to be rested. It might be okay this week. It might be okay. Like I felt no emotion at all that Annie nearly slept through church. Thank you, Matt. But I think there is a busyness issue for us in our society, in our community. It's expected. It's normal. And it's not okay. So I want to talk about rest. And I think often we find ourselves longing for rest. When people come back from holidays, and when I come back from holidays, the question we ask is, how was your holiday? And what I almost always hear is, it was good. But what's the rest of it? Too short, not long enough. Or busy, thanks me. They might be the holidays you organise. They're not the holidays I organise. But, we need rest. And I think we need rest, not just physical, mental and social rest, but we need rest for our souls. In the chapter that I read from the letter of Hebrews has some help for us, giving us thought on what it is to rest throughout the Bible. In the chapter that I read, it gives us 3 moments in the history of God's people, each relating to the land where God would dwell with his people. The first was in verse 4. For somewhere he has spoken about the 7th day in these words. On the 7th day, God rested from all his works. It's a reference to the Garden of Eden, quoting from Genesis chapter 2. And so that idea of rest, where he would stop, where he would rest from his work, it's the beginning of the idea of the Sabbath. God built rest into creation. And the rest he takes on that day is to enjoy the completion of his work. He didn't rest because he was tuckered out. God doesn't get tired. He rested because what he looked at what he created, and he saw that it was very good. He was pleased with what he was created. His works displayed his glory. So he stepped back and looked at it. He'd done what he set out to do. His rest is the satisfaction of a job well done. That's the first moment in the history of rest. He rests after creating the world. In verse 8, it says, for if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken about another day. This is speaking about God's people entering into the promised land when Israel were rescued from Egypt. They complained to God about their circumstances in the wilderness, in the desert. Not the wilderness, in the wilderness. They failed to trust him. So God told that generation they would never enter his rest. And they died out. But Joshua led the next generation in, and part of God's promise about the land was that there would be rest there. Rest from all your enemies, as the book of Deuteronomy records. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. They have not just physical rest, but a kind of social rest, peace and freedom to enjoy lives of goodness and flourishing. They're commanded, just as God had after his work of creation, to rest. They're to have a Sabbath. It's hinted at in verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, God wouldn't have spoken about another day. He looked forward to that other day. And David spoke about it in verse 95. No, not there. Israel was again to be faithful and to rest. Rest is built in. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. God is setting up a structure where rest is to be a part of what we do. Resting is to be a part of how we live. Resting is to be a part of how we live under God. In the later chapters of Hebrews, it talks about rest being in the New Jerusalem, the heavenly city, the city that God has prepared for those who trust in him. The book of Hebrews encourages us to look forward to true and lasting rest when Jesus returns, to look forward. No matter how tired we are now, rest is coming. But there's one more time marker in the chapter, and it's the one that the writer is most concerned with. It is today. God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time later he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted, "Today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." We're looking at today, how we live today. In verse 11 it says, "Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest." What does it look like to make every effort to enter that rest? If we're looking forward to the heavenly city, if we're looking forward to a future with God, if we're to make every effort to enter that rest, well, what will that look like? What will it look like to live that way? How will we rest? How will we guarantee rest? Well, here are 3 ways that I'm going to talk about today. Rest from work, rest from control, and rest in delight. They will come up on the screen again. Rest from work. Work, of course, was one of the first casualties of the fall. Work was there before the fall. We were to work before the fall. Humanity was created in God's image to fill the earth and subdue it. We had jobs. Adam's first job was to name all the animals. Can you imagine that job? Can you imagine being the guy who has to name everything? I know that Jimmy Rees has made money from that idea, but he had to name all the animals. How did he come up with them all? I presume he only came up with them in one language, but that's just the sort of thought that comes to my mind. But there was work to be done. But when the fall happened, work got hard. Work got difficult. Now the ground produces thorns and thistles. Work became about mere survival. By the sweat of his brow, the man was to wrestle with the earth to get food. And along with work becoming toil, there came injustices. Some hoarded the fruit of the labour of others, enslaving them. And the temptation is to find our identity in what we do rather than finding our identity in God. But Jesus comes to give us true rest. Again, when we're in that new city, in that heavenly city, work will be transformed again. Instead of mere survival, there'll be thriving and success and fruitfulness. And when we rest from work now, we look forward to that. How do we do that? Well, I think how do we rest now from work? The most basic level to rest from work now is to actually stop working. It's harder than it sounds, isn't it? I mean, it sounds obvious. How do you rest from work? Well, you stop working. But it's not easy. It's not easy to turn off those emails. It's not easy to turn off the phone. So I don't find it physically hard to turn off the emails or the phone. I find it hard to turn off my brain. Because my brain just keeps going there. Gillian and I had a day off recently, and we had a night away, and we went to the beach and went surfing, and we were chatting, and I'd keep bringing up things about church, and she goes, "Stop! Just leave it till tomorrow." But it's hard to do. It's hard to stop working. Some of us who have people working for us, they need to talk to us today. It's an emergency. Things need to be dealt with, and it's hard to stop working. But it's a good thing to do, to rest. Rest because we're not in control. Rest because we're not in charge. Rest because we're not in charge of everything. Rest from work requires trusting God, doesn't it? To actually rest from work requires trusting that it'll wait. It'll be okay. I'm not responsible for everything. I know some of us have important jobs, much more important than mine. Some of you have people who are responsible to you. and you are responsible for, and when they ring you on your day off when you've said nobody should contact me for any reason at all, and they still contact you because they are absolutely convinced that you need to know. What do you do then? Well, you can make a choice, but you can also choose to trust God. Trust that God will work that out, that it'll wait, that they'll get through it, that other people can take responsibility. I don't think resting from work means doing nothing. I think it means taking time to enjoy the things that we enjoy. Play sport, make music, enjoy time with your family. Do things that you like doing. Some of us like work, and that's a good thing. But I very rarely preach on my day off. I like preaching, but I try not to preach on my day off. But it's good to find the things you love doing and to rest from work to do those things you don't have to do. To take a break. To enjoy the things that God has given you to enjoy. Which of course will all be different, and sometimes you might think, oh, why that would not be a break for me. Last night, the gaming guild, we're all there gaming away on the second last day of the year, and I thought that would be work for me. But they seem to love it, and that's great. So rest from work. Second thing is to rest from control. One of the reasons I think it's so hard to rest from work is that we find it hard to trust that God is actually in control. That God is God and I am not. We can say it, but often our actions show that we don't believe it. We live like we're in charge. We live like, if I do this, that will happen. We live like there's a formula to follow, where I am at the centre. But I think the story of God reminds us that we're not in charge. We do not rule. God is in charge. So it's good to rest from control, to step back and let God be God, to step back and to trust God, to rest in a way that says you're on the throne, you're in the driver's seat, you're in control. And I think that's the reason why we can rest from work. We can stop, we can take a break, we can turn off the phone, we can put off the email, we can allow the auto response to say, I'm off and we'll be back on this date. You could contact this person. The third part about rest that I want to talk about is to rest in delight. When the Bible's story of rest paints a picture of the future, it's not just work that's always enjoyable and successful. There's a special focus on rest where God is at the centre. And we are in relationship with God. It says in Revelation, He will dwell with them and they will be His people and He will be their God. The end point of rest is to delight in God, to find a joy in the presence of God. To delight. We will delight in God. Some people have looked at the book of Revelation and it feels like it's a forever church service, which, look, I'll be honest, sounds awful. I cannot imagine it. But I have no doubt that heaven will be an absolutely joyous experience because God will be at the centre of it. And sitting through a sermon from God will not be like sitting through a sermon from me. There'll be no dull bits. We will stand in awe in the presence of God. We will stand in awe of who He is, of what He's like, of what He's done, of what He's doing. So I think one of the things to do now, when we rest, is to delight in God, is to look for opportunities to delight in who God is, delight in what God is like, to look at His creation and say, wow, that is amazing. To consider the ways that the things that he is doing. One of the things, in a Bible study group I was in many years ago that Gillian and I were in, we used to have a prayer book, not an Anglican prayer book, it wasn't an Anglican church, but we would write down prayer points. And then every few months, we would have a night where we would just look back through prayer points and see the way that God had answered our prayers, the way that God had answered the prayers of the church. And I think there is great delight to be found in looking at the way that God has worked. It's one of the reasons why I decided that we would extend the series on hope to include this week, because I wanted to spend the last day of the year looking at the Bible and thinking about the way that God has worked for us this year, the way that God has worked in us this year. I'm extraordinarily thankful that you guys think it's good that we came, because we've come that we as a church may know God better. And so I think there is delight to be found in knowing who God is and working with him. I think there is great delight to be found in growing our knowledge of the truth. I think rest is a part of what we do, but if we rest without God, without acknowledging God, without recognising God, then is it really rest? I think when we rest, we should do the things that cause our hearts to well up with thankfulness to God. Acknowledge the things that delight us, that make us feel good about who we are. And so often, I think, when we scratch the surface, we recognise that these are the things that God has given us. I mean, celebrating 40 years of marriage, that's an awesome thing. But I'm sure if Paul and Susan think back, they will see God in just about every aspect of their marriage, from, I assume, just getting to the point where they decided to marry each other. It's always God. And so to find that delight in what God has done, I think, is something we can rest in, because it reminds us how good he is. It reminds us how trustworthy he is. I mean, we can look at creation and it is beautiful, and we will look at creation probably tonight. You know, you look at Sydney Harbour, and then if you can still see Sydney Harbour with all the smoke, that'll be even more impressive. But there is wonder to be found. We need to remember who's given it to us, who is in charge, who rules. Rest from work, rest from control, rest in delight. Each of these things, I think, will help us to cultivate hearts that know and trust God's power, that enable us to trust God. My last point for the year, probably not actually, there's many hours to go. I think we need to find the rest beneath the rest. When we read Hebrews 4, you get the sense that there's more than one meaning to the word rest. There's rest from enemies, the kind of rest Israel has in the promised land. But there's deeper rest. There's a longing for a deeper rest. In verse 3, it says, "Now we who have believed enter that rest." So just as God has said, "So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world." There is a rest to come. We can rest now, but it will only be a foretaste of the rest that is to come. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. There is something more to life than this. There is more to life than this rest. I mean, I know we have this image of Australians who, live for the weekend or live for retirement. And to be honest, I think it's changed. The people I see, the people I talk to, I don't think they have much of a weekend. and they don't have much of a, we were talking before about a secret to a good life perhaps is to keep working and to not retire. But I used to really enjoy watching house shows with Gillian, and they built these wonderful houses that so often I would always have this thing in my head where it looks like they've built this awesome house that they'll never be in, that they'll just, come home to sleep in. And I wonder, when are you going to use that fire pit? They always seem to have fire pits. It may have been the mid-2010s when I was watching these shows, but fire pits were always crucial. And yet, we've got a fire pit, and I think we've used it half a dozen times. We haven't used it since we moved to Sydney. There's things where we put rest at the centre, but we never quite get there. And to some extent that makes sense, because there is a rest to come. There is a rest to long for. There is a rest in our future. And it makes sense for us to live in a way, live for that rest. Because the rest that is to come is not about us. The rest that is to come is about Jesus. In Matthew 11, Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." All those things that make us weary, all those heavy burdens that we carry, all those things that make it hard to stop work, all those things that make it hard to give up control, they're the things Jesus came to take. All you who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. He will take the weight upon himself. He has lifted the weight from our shoulders and put it on his own. Jesus came that we might have eternal rest, which is a future thing, but we need to rest now. And as you contemplate 2024, it's worth asking the question, how will I rest in 2024? How will I take those breaks? How will I give up control? How will I stop working? How will I delight in God? Because we live now for the future, but we don't live now forgetting the need to rest. We need to remember to take that break, to take that rest, to rest from work, to rest from control, to rest in delight. Because God is God, and I am not. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you that you are God. I thank you for your love for us. Father, help us to truly understand what it is to live under you. Amen. We're going to keep praying with Rob.